Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's 1A session on Hurricane Maria and climate justice, where we are 5 years later. My name is Jason Velasquez. I use he, him pronouns, and I am today's moderator for the session. I'm calling in from Lenape land, or what is now known as Hempstead, New York. We are joined by five lovely panelists today. We have Ruth Santiago, board member from Earth Justice and a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, also known as WEJAC. We have Adriana Gonzalez, environmental justice organizer in Puerto Rico's Sierra Club. We have Jennifer Valiulis, executive director from St. Croix Environmental Association, Eduardo Bhatia, former Senate president in Puerto Rico, and visiting professor at Princeton University. And we also are joined by Adrian Gardner, the chief executive officer of Smart Tech Nexus and the blockchain company LLC. I'll give a brief session overview now, and then we'll get into our presentation. So today we're going to be discussing Hurricane Maria. In 2017, Hurricane Maria, a Category 5 hurricane, devastated the Caribbean, especially the islands and archipelagos of Dominica, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. The hurricane exacerbated ongoing energy challenges in Puerto Rico, devastating the energy grid and leaving many throughout the Caribbean homeless, as well as causing many casualties. It was the third costliest tropical storm on record. Climate change stands out in all of this as greenhouse gas emissions, rising temperatures, and greater precipitation is intensifying hurricanes and making them more damaging than ever before. It's also important to mention climate change's ongoing and origins in colonialism, which is still also ongoing in the Caribbean today. In this session, panelists will discuss the impacts of health, economic, and social impacts. In addition, panelists will discuss the response and recovery efforts and what changes have occurred in the past 5 years. Panelists will describe policies, initiatives, and programs that have been implemented or that should be implemented to increase community adaptive capacity, improve infrastructure, support coalition building, develop pathways for sovereignty to prevent hurricanes from having similar impacts and devastating impacts to residents experienced due to Hurricane Maria and climate injustice. So with that, we'll hand it off to our first speaker, who is Ruth Santiago.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, and hello, everyone. Happy to be here. I guess someone is going to pull up the slides, or should I do that myself?
Okay.
As Jason mentioned, we're thinking about Hurricane Maria as we approach the 5th anniversary of the landfall on the Caribbean, and specifically, I'm going to talk about Puerto Rico and environmental, climate, and energy justice in Puerto Rico. Hopefully, we've learned some lessons from the 2017 hurricane season, which included also a hurricane prior to Hurricane Maria, like a few days before. And one of the main lessons is that these climatic disasters are not so natural. The underlying conditions in Puerto Rico really exacerbated the impact, the destructive impact of the hurricane. And with respect to the electric system, especially, we have in Puerto Rico a very centralized grid where there are a number of big power plants, mostly located in southern Puerto Rico, transmit energy over lines, wires, poles, towers, mostly to the north, to what is known as the San Juan metropolitan area and other parts of Puerto Rico as well. And they are right in the path of the hurricanes. And so this design, the centralized design, made it possible for the hurricane to really destroy and disable. And as you know, for many months, and in some cases close to a year, communities did not have electric service because not the plants so much, but the design, right? The wires and the transmission distribution system was impacted. And so communities learned that they needed to become energy literate, implement energy efficiency, and otherwise participate in the electric system. And that the PREPA, the public utility, needs a radical transformation, both in terms of technology and governance. And many studies have indicated both those aspects. So community empowerment through participation in the electric system has been called sort of becoming prosumers, not passive, just passive consumers, but rather producers of energy, and primarily through, that can be done through rooftop solar, battery energy storage systems, and as we noted, energy efficiency, conservation, etc. A whole slew of alternatives to the centralized fossil-fired system that we have. And we're actually referring to something called the Energy Green New Deal, because the disaster recovery funding that has been allocated for Puerto Rico, both primarily from FEMA, but also from HUD, could be used to carry out the necessary transformation if the federal government earmarks those funds for the public utility to work with organized communities and local renewable energy contractors to build a decentralized renewable electric system based on rooftop solar, batteries, and similar alternatives. And the proposal that we helped to co-found is known as We Want Sun, Queremos Sol. You can look it up at the website www.queremosolpr.com. And so it's a civil society proposal by environmental, community, labor, academic, professional, and now religious groups that have joined and endorsed, and many other groups have endorsed a proposal that's based primarily on what I mentioned, right? Bringing in, providing access, especially to low and middle income communities that could otherwise not access rooftop solar and battery energy storage systems, and therefore have life-saving resiliency right on their rooftops, energy being provided, and at the same time being connected in hopefully in microgrids. So I want to go back to why Hurricane Maria was really sort of an unnatural disaster, right? The whole backdrop of what the situation was and continues to be in Puerto Rico when the hurricane struck. So Puerto Rico's economic development is based in large part on tax exemptions and other incentives for private investment. And this private investment was supposed to be, and these tax exemptions were granted in exchange for, creating jobs on the island and otherwise bringing supposed economic prosperity. But that never really worked. And so there's always been high unemployment rates. And in some areas, which we'll discuss a little bit in more detail later, the unemployment rate is always over 20%. And of course, that results in a very high poverty rate, which often and recently has been around 44% of the population. And so it has the highest poverty rate of any state or territory. The median household income in Puerto Rico is about $20,000, which is approximately 1/3 of the U.S. median income. And yet we have the second or third highest electric rate. Right now, it might be really close to the first, which is Hawaii. And it's around 33 cents per kilowatt, which is pretty much double the average rate in the U.S. So in conjunction, right, there was the debt crisis, and in part because the government, being starved of income because of all of these tax exemptions, was really financing essential public services with debt, with bond issues. And this all has led to mass migration to the U.S. mainland. Since at least 2006, about 700,000 people have left, mostly working-aged people, professionals, etc. And this situation is even worse in so-called environmental justice communities, or what are known as sacrifice zones, where the power plants are located, where we have, ironically, higher poverty and unemployment rates and lack of public services, essential services like schools, many hospital closings in these underserved areas, especially in the Guayama region, where the most contaminating plants are located. And so within this civil society movement for transformation of the grid, one of the goals is energy justice to combat the energy poverty that's being experienced. And there's a definition, at least one, that says that the energy justice is the goal of achieving equity in both social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remedying social, economic, and health burdens on those disproportionately harmed by the energy system. And what we're seeing in Puerto Rico, unfortunately, is going in the opposite direction. I call it, we're developing two separate energy systems. High-income residents here are acquiring either or leasing rooftop solar and battery storage systems, while low and middle-income residents are relegated to a centralized system that, for example, this week, I had a huge power outage where two of the private plants were taken out of service, the AES coal-fired plant and the Ecoelectric methane gas-fired plant were out of service, apparently somehow connected to the Luma Energy operation of the transmission and distribution system, and problems with that management. So that's what poor and middle income people have to rely on. They don't have access to these rooftop solar systems that higher income people can afford. And that's why we're proposing that the federal funding, disaster recovery funding, be used not to rebuild the same grid, which is what's starting to happen, but rather to invest in rooftop solar. There are small community-based and nonprofit rooftop solar projects, like notably Casa Pueblo, the one of the groups I work quite closely with, Comité Diálogo Ambiental, Cambio, and other community-based and nonprofits are building sort of rooftop solar projects on a small scale, because the funding, the public funding, is not being dedicated to this. And so we are also seeing some large utility scale solar projects, but they're being sited on prime agricultural land, and they are still centralized. They depend on the centralized grid. And by the way, there's a study that indicates that the existing utility scale renewable energy projects took over 1 year and up to 15 months to fully reconnect after Hurricane Maria and provide service. So that is not the answer for Puerto Rico. We really need to decentralize in addition to decarbonize. And so the proposals now, most recently, for new methane gas plants that are really sort of enabled by the Energy Public Policy Act, Law 17, are very strong. The Puerto Rico Energy Bureau recently did a turnaround and said that they would approve and are requiring the construction of 300 to 400 megawatt gas-fired or hydrogen-fired plant, in spite of the viability of the rooftop solar and the studies that indicate that. So the plants that are creating the current plants that are very centralized and are creating all of the contamination and fossil fuel emissions are located, as I mentioned, in southeastern Puerto Rico, AES coal-fired power plant, and the PREPA, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Complex, which is the largest electrical facility in Puerto Rico. The proposal for the use of disaster recovery funds is totally viable, and FEMA and the environmental justice requirements indicate that FEMA can use these disaster recovery funds for rooftop solar and storage. And so the question is, will the government of Puerto Rico and FEMA and the federal government administration rebuild the same centralized grid, and or will we have a totally new opportunity to provide a resilient energy system and energy justice to the people of Puerto Rico? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruth. I want to remind everybody that as you watch these presentations, to put your questions in the chat section, and we will get to a Q&A session at the end of all the presentations today. Up next, we have Adriana Gonzalez from the Sierra Club. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana Gonzalez. I am an organizer with the Sierra Club. I think they'll put up my slides in a minute. There we go. Next. So the Sierra Club is a nonprofit organization based in the U.S. and Puerto Rico. But I'm here today to talk about our experience with environmental justice organizing and with Hurricane Maria. We can go to the next slide. And this picture is actually from the street right next to my house, and it accentuates what a lot of us saw the day that we woke up after Maria. And in that street, there was a centennial tree. So it was a huge tree that was there for a lot of time, and it exemplified that we lost not only a lot of life, a lot of everything, but a lot of our landscape and things that we knew for a long time changed. You can go to the next one. Obviously, a lot of people lost their roofs, lost their housing, lost their livelihoods, and you can see here the roof of someone that just blew out. And it in Maria, a lot of what was happening already in Puerto Rico was just highlighted. A lot of people had already housing insecurity. Maria just highlighted everything that was happening in Puerto Rico in a very crude way. You can go to the next slide. And it also accentuated that we have an aging population that, like Ruth was mentioning, there's a lot of migration of people outside of the island, especially people in working ages. So this scene that you see here, which is an older woman herself picking up her street, is something that we saw a lot during Hurricane Maria. And it accentuated the need that we have to have access for better infrastructure to our aging population. Can go to the next slide. This is actually a picture that I took at my local bakery right behind my house, and you can see that people were all over trying to get food. And food insecurity is something that we've had in Puerto Rico, sadly, for a long time. That again, Maria accentuated not only because it flattened crops, but because the food chain that we have in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of import of food, so that was accentuated, and people really had a frenzy to identify where they would eat every day. You can go to the next one. And then the fossil fuels, as Ruth was mentioning, energy in Puerto Rico, a lot comes from fossil fuels, if not, you would say everything. But Maria accentuated the need that we not only need to move away from fossil fuels, but we need access to energy systems that are based on energy that we have in the island, and that is the sun. Here you see one of the many lines of people waiting to fill up gas tanks, to either run the power in their houses or run their car or run a generator or anything like that. And again, the fossil fuels in Puerto Rico is something that we need to really move away from, because we see that in an emergency like this, the chain and the supply is not going to be the same. Go to the next one. And another thing that was accentuated was the infrastructure. In Puerto Rico is a very car-based infrastructure, so people that couldn't move their cars because either they were damaged, either because they didn't have gas, had an even harder time getting to the help that they needed. You can go to the next one. So a lot was lost in Maria, and a lot was also, again, accentuated. Things that were already happening in Puerto Rico were highlighted. And you can go to the next one. So again, in recent years, Puerto Rico has had hurricanes, we've had floods, we've also had droughts, we've had earthquakes, we've had air quality issues, and we've had unprecedented high temperatures. We had the pandemic, we've had economic depression, social crisis. And when we go through all of that, it can be very disheartening for anyone to either, first of all, feel safe or feel that there's hope for our island to move forward. That on top of obviously the climate crisis that we're facing, which is, of course, consequence of the endless pursuit of profit and exploiting our Earth system. So A little bit of what we as Sierra Clubbers and community organizers faced after Maria was that we needed to take all these things and put it to action. One of the questions that they sent us for this session was asking us about what environmental justice is for us and how do we see it. So I'll show you the next slides a little bit of what we see in Sierra Club in our communities as environmental justice. Yeah. So the first one is we started to support and build strong community leadership. We started giving community leaders the tools that they needed to either open up roads, open up access to communities. And this is one of those groups that we were supporting. You can go to the next one. This is another community that we started to give out solar lanterns, and it was very interesting as we started to talk about solar energy in Puerto Rico. When we were doing that work, one of my most heartfelt stories was in this community where we were handing out solar lanterns, and we see this, this person that received a solar lantern, and we explained how it worked. We explained the solar panel, the battery, and everything. And the person was just looking at us very confused. Like they had never seen a solar panel. They had never held anything like that in their hands. And they were very skeptical that it was going to work. So the day after we gave them out the lanterns, we go back to provide more food and check on the folks in the community, and the face of this person was amazing. He was lit up, and he came out of this house saying like, "Oh my God, it actually worked. I put it out in the sun, and I was very skeptical that it was gonna work, but it actually does, and it lasted all night." So again, highlighting that the loss of power in Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria did give access to a lot of people that didn't have any solar knowledge to have it in their hands. You can go to the next one. This is more of the solar lanterns that we gave out. And again, as we were giving them out after Hurricane Maria, we made sure that we were not just handing them out, but educating people about what is solar energy and what can it mean for the future of Puerto Rico. Go to the next one. We also support long-term opportunities for social and economical development. This is one of the local farms that we supported after Maria, with basically funding for them to build better infrastructure and rebuild after the farms after Maria. Go to the next one. More of our solar lanterns, and what we really emphasized was that people that were distributing the solar lanterns were community leaders that had relationships with the community that they were giving them. Go to the next one. Again, part of the teachings that we did, explaining people how these lanterns worked. Go to the next one. And then infrastructure is the third thing that we focus. So again, with Maria, we wanted to ensure that people had a long-term change in their lives after it happened for the better. So this is one of the images where we distributed about 250 water filtration systems that could last folks for a year long. So that people didn't just have a bottle of water at that moment, but had a long-term solutions that they felt safe after the hurricane. You can go to the next one. We also gave, this is a local farmer from Eduardo, who we distributed, again, materials for them to continue their work and expand in different ways after Maria. We actually were giving them their composting materials for them to take all the compostable debris in their houses. Go forward. Forward. Just because we are... and again, so Hurricane Maria is a continuous tragedy. And right now what we're doing is building long-term solutions. We're focusing on transforming our island and not just rebuilding, but supporting economic growth and social opportunities for the people in our island. Go to the next one. Ruth already mentioned Queremos Sol. We are both part of that initiative, so this is more of that. And for us at the Sierra Club, it has been really great to work with this group because we've been able to develop what is a community-led approach to public policy of what can the future of Puerto Rico be if we have distributed solar rooftop energy that is based in a public energy system. Go to the next one, which is just the web page. Again, if you want to see the Queremos Sol proposal, you can look for it there. Go to the next one. And it just focuses on rooftop solar using part of the federal funds to implement the plan. And what is very important for myself as an organizer is that there's no new fossil fuel infrastructure in Puerto Rico. Go to the next one. And that's what we've been focusing in after Maria a lot, is ensuring that the fossil fuel industry in Puerto Rico doesn't have any more opportunities to build any new plants, that communities like the ones that are in Guayama facing daily health hazards from coal-fired power plants have an opportunity to not only close that coal-fired power plant, but have a better quality of life in their communities. Go to the next one. We've also been opposing to the privatization of our energy grid because we understand that the energy is a human right. So as we privatize things that we think everyone should have access for, we see that it detriments the understanding of people of why we need energy. Maria gave us a really harsh reality of what it was to not have power. And a lot of people not only lost their lives, but were confronted with a reality that they had never seen. So we want to make sure that as we build our energy system back, it is accessible to everyone. Go to the next one. One of the other things that we are promoting is a overall policy, which you can find the link there. We can share it. It's a 10-point minimum agenda for what Puerto Rico and its policymakers need to do for us to have a clear path to address the climate crisis in Puerto Rico. There's 10 points minimum that go from creating a transversal public policy on climate in Puerto Rico to also addressing land planning, citizen participation, and actions to mitigate and address the climate crisis in Puerto Rico. Go to the next one. So we strive to have communities that not only are living the climate crisis, but have the tools to address the climate crisis. We are building activists and leaders that have the tools that they need to address the changes that are happening in their community in a proactive way that creates jobs, that creates economy. You can go to the next one, which is my last example, which is one of the communities in the Northeast Corridor that we work with. This is a community that I myself have been organizing with since 2012. And right now we have been able to secure protection of a natural reserve. But not only that, we've been creating jobs in the last 2 years for local people to work in the environmental reserve. And again, it's not only protecting our natural habitats, it's not only creating and addressing the climate crisis, but it's also creating opportunities for the community. Go to the next one, which is my last one. And this is what I do every Tuesday morning. I volunteer with leaders to monitor leatherback turtles. And it's very amazing work. And it's just highlighting the fact that we are in an island that is so beautiful, that is so rich, and that we have access to beautiful things like the leatherback turtles, and we need to make sure that the future generations can also go out on Tuesday morning and see baby leatherback turtles on the beach. So the last slide is my last one with just my information, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adriana. I'm hearing a lot of themes of decentralization, decarbonization, community-led initiatives. I was in Puerto Rico back in June, and I helped some leatherback turtles in Fajardo make their way to the sea. So that was just a beautiful moment when I was back home in June. Up next, we're going to hear from Jennifer, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Good morning. Can I get my slides up? Thank you. So I just wanted to say my Sunday mornings are actually spent monitoring leatherback turtles and looking for hatchlings on turtle beaches as well. So it sounds like that's something that a lot of us have in common in terms of our inspiration or what keeps us going. So good morning. As Jason mentioned, my name is Jennifer Valiulis. I am the executive director of the St. Croix Environmental Association, which is a very small NGO located on St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I'm going to give you a snapshot today about how Hurricane Maria affected us and kind of where we are now from the perspective of a small community-centered NGO. Next slide. So to orient you, because not everybody knows who we are and where we are, the U.S. Virgin Islands is about 80 miles east of Puerto Rico. We have three main islands. To the north are St. Thomas and St. John, which we refer to as the Northern Virgin Islands. And to the south is St. Croix, which is the largest of the islands and where I'm located. And that's the islands are 40 miles apart. And this is actually significant in terms of kind of how Maria affected us. So next slide. When Maria came to St. Croix, it was a Category 5 storm, and it hit the west end of our island. And this is September 20th, 2017. But at that time, we were actually already in recovery from Hurricane Irma, which was also a Category 5 storm that hit the Northern Virgin Islands of St. Thomas and St. John. And so usually when we get hurricanes in the Virgin Islands, because of the distance between the two kind of sets of islands, if one island gets hit hard or bears the brunt of the storm, the other islands can pitch in to help. There's enough distance that they were not so severely impacted. That the island that was less impacted can serve as a refuge. We actually evacuate people in hospitals. The other island can provide healthcare and supplies, and a lot of the recovery personnel and supplies can be directed to the island that was hit worse. In this case, however, that was not possible because, can you go back? Thanks. Because all of the islands faced absolutely catastrophic damage and had very desperate, dire needs. Our entire power grid was wiped out, and there was damage to the vast majority of homes and buildings across all three islands. And this is in addition to flooding that came between the two hurricanes and in the weeks after. Okay, next slide. So it's already been mentioned a little bit, but at that time, Maria kind of tore a path of damage across not just the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, but kind of up the Caribbean, in addition to other hurricanes that had really caused a lot of damage around. And so the resources that there were insufficient and were directed in different places. Response resources were diluted. And overall, as Ruth spoke of, the system for response and distribution of resources was compromised. We, in the Virgin Islands, again, as I mentioned, we kind of rely on ourselves, on our other islands to support us. And we really didn't have a disaster plan in place for this situation where we could not support ourselves. So we found ourselves in a situation which was a little bit unique in that we were really strongly, more than ever, relying on outside support. And we, I think similarly to Puerto Rico, probably are not the highest on the list of priorities for distribution of resources when we are relying on, federal help. We are a territory. Many would say that puts us at colonial status. We didn't receive the attention in the media that others did. And so when we did get resources, a lot of them came late. not in time, or we got inappropriate or subpar supplies, things that didn't apply for Caribbean living or for our landscape. And so it sounds like very similar to Puerto Rico. We really relied on our community, both in-house and our community in other places. Friends who were in the States, or even Virgin Islanders who were on vacation and couldn't get back, we're sending food, we're sending generators, we're sending chainsaws, we're sending all of the things that we needed that we couldn't get. Just basic stuff like road clearing. So an example from my situation, I lived in an area called the Rainforest, and our roads in and out of the area are limited. There's one road. And we couldn't get out for days. And one day, just coming along the road was a guy with a chainsaw and his two friends. And those three people went through our road and freed us basically to go out and, figure out what was going on and to try to find water and food. And if we had waited for the official government response, we would have waited for weeks for that to happen. So we really were relying on just individuals and community to help us for recovery. I am painting this in broad strokes. There were some lights. There were a lot of, on island, there were a lot of rescue personnel that were dealing with their own losses, that had lost their homes and their businesses, their livelihoods. But we're still continuing to work around the clock to help the community, whether, not knowing if they would be compensated for it. So that was kind of the initial response. Now, once there was federal response or outside response that came and was helping us, we ran into some issues that I think are kind of local issues. A lot of the official paperwork that FEMA or the insurance companies needed to distribute funds or supplies relied on paperwork that people had lost, or in the case of the Virgin Islands, many ownership of homes tends to be family oriented and passed down from generation to generation. So we don't necessarily have the traditional deeds or the paperwork that is required for compensation or for relief. We also don't have a traditional addressing system. So finding people or their homes was challenging as well. Longer term challenges are that, as many are running into, we are having a cumbersome process for funding, and the match requirements are beyond the scope of what the Virgin Islands can handle. And of course, a lot of the long-term funding that's coming about is being played with for politics. This is an election year for our governor, and that just means that, money that comes in is not necessarily directed in ways that it should be. Okay, next slide. Okay, so our ongoing challenges are that our economy has profoundly changed. We have lost many small businesses. Many people have left. We have a housing shortage due to the damage of buildings, but also because housing costs have skyrocketed. The stipends for relief workers were extraordinary compared to what the regular income is here, and those have not changed over time. We also still do not have a lot of our schools and a functional hospital. And so this has a lot of these are the key elements of a healthy community. And so we are not yet at a healthy community status. It's also opened up, I guess I would say, opportunities for off-island opportunists that don't have ties to the community and that tend to be extractive and displacing Virgin Islanders. Next slide. So what this has ended up happening is there have been a lot of economic quick fixes that have been proposed and that have gone into, that are happening right now. Some of the big ones include the restarting of a massive oil refinery that has caused just extraordinary problems throughout the island. There's a lot of extractive or inappropriate clearing of land and abusive land practices, including large-scale agriculture that is not appropriate for our practices here or our local conditions. And kind of, tying that back to the hurricanes, although Maria was a very strong hurricane and Irma was a strong hurricane, as it's been said before, these were rare, but are likely to be more common. It's historically an unusual event, but will be more common in the future. And we're already seeing globally disaster after disaster. So we expect that the response and recovery resources are going to continue to be stretched thin. And so last slide. And so it sounds like, similar to Puerto Rico, our community organizations are working together to address these issues. Our government really has not recognized the hurricanes or even the drought and all the other issues that we're facing as climate issues. And as such is sort of responding to them individually. And so we have a couple of organizations like the St. Croix Foundation for Community Development that is providing grants. We are all, most of our community organizations are one or two people. And so we are working together. This is a farmers meeting that we had recently where we talked about how we can all come together and work to find solutions. We've had town halls where we talk about where we want our economy to go in a sustainable way. And so essentially the community groups are having to fill in these need gaps in the community where our government has failed us or where we expect to be, increasingly isolated from limited recovery resources. So that's kind of where we are in the Virgin Islands, which sounds quite similar to Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I want to pull out some key themes. Again, just some more extractive opportunist conversations, quick fix and false solutions. We have to talk about the migration and impacts of diaspora communities in the response and recovery, and also just the depletion of social services and social resources. So it's interesting to hear some of those overlaps between St. Croix and Puerto Rico. And I want to pass it over to Eduardo now.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm Eduardo Bhatia. I'm a former Senate President of the Senate of Puerto Rico, and I'm currently at Princeton University teaching public policy. I want to sort of focus my presentation on what are some of the lessons. And I think the first lesson, you just heard three wonderful people from three wonderful NGOs. And I think the first lesson that I think we can start with is the number of non-government organizations that were either created or flourished as a result of the hurricanes. And I want to commend all, Jennifer and Ruth and Adriana for, the wonderful leadership they have provided both in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Next, I think we have seen some of the destruction, but I want to put the context of Puerto Rico also into play here. Puerto Rico's, Hurricane Maria was just 4 months after Puerto Rico had filed for bankruptcy. And that's a key element for some of the issues that we have to discuss today in terms of financing the new infrastructure and financing, the projects that are being built on the island. Next. And again, as I think Adriana was showing, our whole infrastructure in terms of our grid failed, but PREPA, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, had also filed for bankruptcy 4 months before, and PREPA's debts were in the vicinity of $10 to $11 billion, which means that you had a utility that was not ready to make any loans or borrow money to fix the system that had just been destroyed. So that's, again, another element that I think has to be taken into account where when looking in and seeing some of the results and when we look at the lessons in the future. Next. I think that slide was also shown by Jennifer. We kind of borrowed slides from each other, but that's sort of to give you an idea of how dark it was, how bad it was, and it wasn't just a few days after the hurricane. It actually lasted for months. People did not have electricity. Communities were fully dark, and again, that goes to show how the grid had been destroyed throughout the island, and not only the grid, sort of the generating systems throughout Puerto Rico. Next. That sort of shows, that picture I think shows the initial response by the federal government. Everybody talks about that all over the United States and elsewhere. And it's the short visit of President Trump, and where he's just throwing paper towels. I know it has been used, and it's kind of almost a cliche. Everybody uses the same picture, but I want to raise it because it's important to know that the president did not visit poor communities, did not visit damaged communities. He was just in sort of wealthy Guaynabo, Puerto Rico, and again, it all boiled down to a very short and inconsequential visit by the president of the United States. Next. As part of his visit, he said personally that he didn't see much damage and he didn't see any death as a result, or very few deaths as a result of Maria. It was not until May 2018, about 7-8 months later, that the Harvard School of Public Health came up with a serious scientific study saying that from their estimates, close to 4,500 or 4,600 people, and you can go to the next slide, died as a result of Hurricane Maria. So the actual number was really hard to sort of come to, but based on interviews, based on talking to family members, so many people had left, but after a year, almost a year, the number was not negligible by any means. It was a very serious consequence, and it was not just the hurricane. The hurricane itself did not kill that many people. It was the aftermath of the hurricane. It was not having electricity. It was not having refrigerators for medicines. It was having hospitals with no services. So what I think the point I want to make here is how the aftermath and how first responders, whoever they are, either state, local, or federal, failed the people of Puerto Rico after the hurricane. Next, please. This is I think one of the most revealing lessons. It was FEMA itself. FEMA put out a report in the summer of 18 saying basically they failed Puerto Rico, that they were not ready. I mean, the report is available on the internet. You can actually download it, and it goes one after the next analysis of what went wrong. But truth be told, it is obvious that the federal government was not ready, and that the federal government did not know how to deal with the issue in Puerto Rico. There was a cultural issue. There was a language issue. To give you an idea, you just saw a slide that had no electricity. So FEMA's rules had changed, and the only way you could file a complaint, or file more than a complaint, a report that your property had been decimated, was doing it digitally. So you had to have a computer and electricity to actually upload the information. How could you do that if there was no electricity? And I think, after 5, 6, 7, 10 days, we started telling FEMA folks. So it was the teachers and the teachers' unions that came to the rescue. And they basically got tablets and started going community by community, and then coming back to San Juan where there was some electricity, and kind of uploading the information that had been given by residents. So residents could not really do the work. And that's important for all of us. Next slide, please. This is something that I think is important that we show, and it's the initial response. Out of $4.5 billion of responses, just check out how much of that went to U.S. contractors and not to Puerto Rico contractors. Only a minimum amount, almost less than 10% of the amount went to local contractors. And that's another lesson that I wanted to cover. Next. I'm going to go fast because I know I have only 5 minutes left. The response team in Puerto Rico has been centralized. Next slide. And one of the big problems is that all the money that is being given to Puerto Rico goes directly to the state government and not to NGOs, not to municipalities, and that is creating another problem in terms of distributing and dispersing the money that has been allocated to Puerto Rico. Next slide. Over 68, now more than $70 billion have been allocated for Puerto Rico. That's a huge amount of money. And my main concern right now is that the money that is being given to Puerto Rico, allocated to the island and approved by the United States Congress, some of it will have to be returned for not being able to obligate it on time. And that's just, I think, a sin for the people of Puerto Rico. Next, please. That's an idea of how many projects are under construction right now. Over 2,000 projects are either being are under procurement, design, permits, and construction right now. And many more are still waiting for the government of Puerto Rico to actually disperse the money. Next slide, please. That's another slide that I think we could talk to in terms of the questions and answers, in terms of PREPA and the award strategy for rebuilding the local grid. It's still very slow, but the money is there to rebuild the whole grid in Puerto Rico. Next, please. Now, I'm going to go into something that Ruth mentioned, which is we're still burning fossil fuels, and I'm totally against burning fossil fuels. We're still over 90% dependent on centralized generators. Next slide, please. And I think that's what we should be aiming for. I mean, the idea of distributed energy is the hope that we have on Act 17, which I was one of the two authors of Act 17. The idea is that what we wanted to do is sort of slowly move into a distributed energy and creating microgrids. We are the first jurisdiction in the United States to have regulations on microgrids, and I think Puerto Rico is slowly taking advantage of that. But of course, there's a lot of friction between different groups, and I'll go into that in 1 minute. Next slide, please. Of course, again, the idea of the prosumer has been introduced all over the United States, and in terms of Puerto Rico, we are hoping that more people will opt to have solar, rooftop solar panels and basically become producers of energy. Now, we have created a green bank. A green bank has been created by the government of Puerto Rico. It's not in service yet. It was part of the law in 2019, I'm sorry. So the green bank is there. Now, it has to be funded. And I think one of the main pressure points that we need to work on right now is making sure that the federal government's awards to Puerto Rico go to this green bank, and making sure that that disparity that Ruth spoke about of wealthy people getting solar panels and not low-income people have to, we have to take care of that. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is just to tell you that the U.S. Department of Energy is working on something called the Puerto Rico 100. Please make sure that you go into their website and see what they're doing. They're doing a study on how to get Puerto Rico 100% renewable. It's a great study. Next slide. Next slide. So that's sort of who is attacking renewable energy in Puerto Rico. So I talked about the debt. So the Puerto Rico bondholders, the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, some political parties, the oil and gas industry, some labor unions, utility management, and AES and Ecoelectrica. Next slide. And this is the one that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'll just spend 1 minute and I'll be over. Number one, there are 6 lessons that I think we should sort of take as a takeaway from my presentation. Is disinformation kills people in emergencies, and this is something that it could be very basic, but it's important that we all talk about. Number 2, we have to develop an early mechanism to prefer local contractors. I mean, local contractors were ready in Puerto Rico. So many contractors from outside of Puerto Rico came. Part of the solution for Puerto Rico, it has to be with local people. Local people also needed the contracts and the jobs. Number 3, distribution of federal funds must be decentralized. By centralizing into one sole agency of the state government is opening the doors for political cronies, and it's also opening the doors for the kind of problems that we're seeing on the island. Fourth, design and rebuild thinking of the future. Forget about rebuilding the old grid or the old generating machines. Go into distributed energy. Number 5, I agree with the panelists, distributed energy is the answer. And number 6, delineate a strategy early to engage your enemies. You will find many enemies if you want to move from the fossil fuels to the renewable energy that we're aiming for in Puerto Rico. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. I'm excited to almost reach our Q&A session because I think there's interesting questions about developing some initiatives in alignment with making sure that we are taking care of rural communities, our elders, and getting across all those intersections in these processes. But before that, last but not least, I'm going to hand it off to Adrian Gardner for our last presentation for today.
And let me begin by thanking my fellow panelists because the information they've shared is vitally important to what I believe and what I was pushing for when I was at FEMA to build a resilient Caribbean and for the Caribbean to work in unison to help each other in times of high stress. My name is Adrian Gardner, and good morning, and thank you to the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health, Dr. Scobie Wilson, and the University of Maryland for the opportunity to appear before you. As a former Chief Information Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency during the nation's response and recovery operations in the aftermath of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, it was my privilege and honor to serve the citizens of the United States Virgin Islands and the Commonwealth before, during, and after Maria landfall. I was personally responsible for landing the first plane there to bring communications back to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So the mobile units that you saw arriving on the island, I was at NDC personally navigating those through the White House and then landed them on the island to bring back communications. I spent more than 7 years of my life growing up on St. Croix, so went to St. Dunstan's Episcopal School. And the last year of my federal career, which spanned 30 years, I supported response and recovery operations on the USVI in Puerto Rico on residence, on island. Therefore, this topic for me is extremely personal. I have friends there, family there, people that I care about that were in harm's way throughout this whole ordeal. However, those are the same experiences that have become sort of the driver for my small business that I created, the Chain Block Company, LLC, which focuses on protecting supply chains and reducing the risk of disruption. With my allotted time, I elected to provide you with 3 lessons learned based on my experiences on the ground during response and recovery operations, and finally answering the question, where are we 5 years later? Next slide, please. So if you look at lesson 1, it's, this news is not new, right? I mean, there was a failure to broadly apply lessons learned for Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, which led to cascading electric utility and communications disruptions. If I give you the example of communications, you look at the picture on the left where folks had to walk to a cell tower in order to communicate with their family members to tell them that they were safe. That was a reality, right? And again, this is not new because if you look at this National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee report in 2006, they already expressed the concerns over this interdependency between power and communications. And then as Eduardo was saying, one of the things that I think the rest of the panelists, we really have to begin to architect for survivability and resilience. What that means is I'll give you an example of the communications. There was a lot of undersea cables in Puerto Rico. They just happened to all land in San Juan, which means if I took out San Juan, the entire island's communications infrastructure went down. And then, as you mentioned, applying for assistance, right? Even looking at the interdependency between the power grid and communications, it was really just a devastating story. Next slide, please. Lesson 2 is really now talking about an island community versus the continental U.S. All the things you're that the panelists before me spoke to are not things that we experience here in the U.S. And that's because there's access, right? So obviously an island is surrounded by ocean on all sides, but it's often physically beyond the reach of humanitarian relief personnel and material resources, right? I mean, I sat in the National Response Recovery Center there in FEMA, but outside of the 2 weeks that I spent on the ground immediately, I think after Maria hit landfall, for 70 days there, listening to and helping support response and recovery actions, but it was different, right? And we sort of treated it as though it was the same, but an island, response is much different than a CONUS response, a continental U.S. response. So, we often think of evacuation as a proven disaster mitigation strategy. You heard Ruth say that, we thought we could move folks from St. Croix to St. John and St. Thomas and so forth, but most island communities don't have that as an option to move sort of large portions of their populations and evacuate them. So it's simply, in most cases, impossible. The next one is unlike many communities planning for and exercising self-sufficiency throughout the disaster impact is really just an option for them. My belief is for island communities, it is critical. And then the final one, and you heard a lot about NGOs and community organizations and the role that they play, the vital role that they play. Like they actually were the first responders, believe it or not. So, because there were many areas on the island, as Ruth and Eduardo and others have mentioned, that they simply couldn't get to. So therefore, it was the community that served as the first responder. So one of the things that I believe is we must begin to sort of strengthen and develop alliances and partnerships between infrastructure suppliers, both in Puerto Rico, the USVI, as well as with those community organizations. Next slide, please. Lesson 3 is we must harness the power of the human spirit. So citizens of Puerto Rico and USVI are strong and resilient. No question about it. I was astounded by their resilience. I saw it up front and real. They are to be commended for that, but that is not something that should become a norm for them, right? We should think about different ways to support them in times of crisis. And as I mentioned, 7 months after Maria landfall, you still had 100,000 Americans without power on the island of Puerto Rico. And, after landfall, 96% of telecommunications and cell sites were out on Puerto Rico. 77% were out in the USVI. You also have to look at, again, this play on suppliers. I was one of the ones that worked with the Federal Communications Commission to open up roaming, where you could roam from AT&T to Verizon across the island, so that if you were in a place where an AT&T tower was down but a Verizon tower was up, you could at least connect, right? We must maintain sort of strong sort of networks that were formed and are crucial to building sustained community resilience, right? I mean, I think there are lessons that were learned that we must capture, document, and exercise on the regular, right? We should have at least a quarterly sort of event where we go back and roll back to the circumstances post, right after landfall, and exercise how those communities work together, and then document that and put that into practice. Next slide, please. Finally, sort of where are we 5 years later, right? So after multiple natural disasters, in my opinion, both islands are more vulnerable, even with the amount of money that's being spent. And again, that goes back to are we planning really for resilience and survivability? So as a result, I believe that the critical infrastructure is still at high risk, as well as the social safety net is at risk. Puerto Rico, this was mentioned before about, the post-Hurricane Maria exodus reinforces patterns of depopulation resulting in a decline in government services and unemployment, right? And so the closing of schools, and which is increasing poverty rates among our most advantaged. So I also, would highlight, which I didn't in the words here, is people with disabilities. I mean, that many of them were just simply locked in, did not have access, right? So they had a completely different experience than other survivors. The next one is, after Hurricane Maria inflicted sort of mass trauma on the island residents, as well as the infrastructure, residents continue to exhibit high rates of mental illness and post-traumatic stress disorders. So I think it was Ruth that spoke about, what represents a healthy community. So if we looked at the social determinants of health, we would see that many of those are those things that are required to have a healthy community are fragile or missing. The next one is sort of a formal and informal community organizations must be resourced and prepared to lead disaster resilience operations in times of stress, because I do believe that they are sort of our first responders. And then finally, Puerto Rico and the USVI must develop and strengthen their alliances and work together to create and implement a joint contingency plan for disaster preparedness and response. I know that is something that is vital for, again, both islands, but there is a cultural difference among them. But I think we have to get over it and actually put our people first. With that, I'll turn it back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for that presentation, and thank you all for being amazing panelists. I want to get into some of our question and answer session here to wrap up our session. I see a couple questions in the comments, and one of them was referenced in Puerto Rico, but I also want to get your perspective, Jennifer, as well. So this is, how do you see how do you see those in the continental U.S. Playing a role with community-based organizations and NGOs in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico? And can you see a reality in which members of the diaspora return? And I want to start with Jennifer to get your perspective on the Virgin Islands, and then we'll hear from everybody else.
Sure. Well, I think having people like Adrian in positions, people who understand the islands, right? People who understand the specific culture and the challenges that are unique to us in in day-to-day life, but also in the face of recovery, is huge. Because, if there's no representation of the islands, and we're never going to change anything. So having people in place, but also whether or not that's, as a professional, I kind of am always advocating for listening to what the community needs, so continuous conversations with the communities, not just one-off, not just, when we need it, but let's continue to talk about, what is needed, and going beyond just the local government, because the things that the local government will represent as needs are not necessarily representative of the entire community. In terms of return of the diaspora, we talk about that a lot. I mean, that's been a goal in the Virgin Islands, is to have a lot of, particularly our young people, return. And it's an overall challenge because of all of the things that we've been talking about. Housing prices are extraordinary. Our schools are in terrible shape. Our hospitals are, we don't have a real functional ER in St. Croix. And so we need to make this, there needs to be more attraction, more reason for people to return other than their ties to their family. Those are strong ties, but or ties to the island. Those are strong ties, but they're not going to put food in people's mouths or pay for housing, is basically what it comes down to. So, there's a lot of things that need to happen to really bring people back to the Virgin Islands. But like I said, it's a goal. We would love for it to happen.
Awesome, Jennifer. I would love to hear about this response too from Adriana and then Ruth, and then I'll ask some other questions.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I resonate a lot with what Jennifer was saying. First of all, we do need representation of people that not only understand Puerto Rico and all the other islands that are here represented, but that also have experience with it. I think something that we talked about right after Maria was that telling the stories of people that were here was important, but more than that was creating again the infrastructure to get the people that can make decisions really not only understand but be people that are maybe from one of the islands. One of the things that we have been working, there's a lot of diaspora groups in Florida and New York that we've worked with. So obviously, if you are one of those diaspora person, you can join local groups that do either work with the communities that you already live there that are, have Puerto Rican representation, or that even support the local groups here. Again, with Sierra Club, we have worked with other Sierra Club chapters to either build momentum for campaigns or anything like that. So getting involved in your community also supports, making sure that the messages that we want to take get where they want. And about people returning, I've had personal experiences with that. My sister, she studied in the US. She was there for a long time, and then she came back. And again, she didn't came back in a, in the most successful way, in the meaning that the wages here are not, wages that people want to take. The infrastructure, like Jennifer was mentioning, is not something that will bring people back. So we need better wages, better infrastructure to make sure that the people that do come back want to stay here. And yeah, it's something that I think we all strive for.
And Jason, if I could just contribute one comment. I mean, one of the things that I've just thought of in the aftermath and after leaving public service is really even modeling like the Partnership for Public Service, where we would pay them to actually come back and contribute, right? I mean, so there are models out there that we could leverage to really make it a easier transition back. I've been back several times. I used to sit on the U.S. Virgin Islands Research and Technology Park Board for about 5 years. So I saw the devastation to the park, and still trying to bring industry back, but we also need them to bring jobs. So this whole thing of, I think that Eduardo mentioned or was mentioning about the tax incentives, we need to start holding those companies accountable because they are getting tax write-offs, but we need to also have them bring back jobs. I think the last thing I would say is, looking at community, we often think we understand them, but as I think it was Jennifer or Ruth saying, we truly don't, right? I mean, in a lot of cases we don't. So we have to have this sustained communication with them to really understand what are their priorities. A lot of times we come in with our own priorities because we see what's on CNN or whatever we've heard from other folks. We need to really keep that dialogue open so that we have a good understanding and we are meeting them where they are and providing the things that they need.
Yeah, so I'll jump in briefly. So the diaspora made the difference between life and death after Hurricane Maria in many communities throughout Puerto Rico. I saw an incredible mobilization by diaspora groups and other stateside groups and throughout different communities in the States to bring the help that was needed in light, especially the context of austerity that Puerto Rico in particular was living. So let's not forget that the Federal Oversight Board had cut all kinds of services. The government of Puerto Rico didn't have the funding to really respond. And so the diaspora came in addition to just providing life-saving, just everything, as Adriana mentioned, Sierra Club got huge donations to help communities, including community groups in Salinas and Guayama, provide these especially solar lamps and relate similar resources. And so that was one thing. But in the current situation, the diaspora is critical because this historic amount of federal disaster relief, the funding that has been allocated to Puerto Rico in general and for the electric system in particular, the diaspora can influence how that money is spent, how that money is invested. And to the extent that the diaspora can work with communities and organizations and influence the government of Puerto Rico and the federal government policies to earmark those funds for distributed renewables, for sustainable housing, for protecting agricultural lands from utility scale projects, that is very important in our colonial context. Let's not forget, we do not have voting power in the states, right? We do not have congressional representatives with voting power. We can't vote for the president. We have no influence really other than through the diaspora. And we've seen that the congressional representatives that are Puerto Rican origin are like Nidia Velázquez, like it used to be Luis Gutierrez and others that really stood up for Puerto Rico and were able to move things along to a certain extent.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Eduardo, I want to get you involved too. And there's a specific question about the role of the Green Bank in Puerto Rico. What is it? Who can fund it?
The Green Bank was created by Law 17 of 2019. It was recently sort of finally created by the governor. It has a board of directors, but it's not operating yet. So we're kind of disappointed. The initial funding was going to be $400 million. I am in conversations, and I have been in very informal conversations with the White House, basically trying to say that the monies that are coming to Puerto Rico, they should be geared towards the Green Bank, and the Green Bank should have a system in place to make sure they give, either grants or loans to poor communities to make sure that what is happening in Casa Pueblo can be replicated in many other places in a more systematic way, and not just sort of leave it to one NGO to do what they're doing, which is it's a great thing in terms of distributed energy. But if I can also jump in just for a second on the previous question, I think that, the diaspora is not only crucial, but groups like the Hispanic Federation have done a great job helping and aiding Puerto Rico. And I think there are three elements that I think we have to talk about. We have to talk about schools, public schools in Puerto Rico. We want to return to having, good schools on the island. You want to return to having good jobs, and that was mentioned already. You want to return having a good infrastructure for electricity, but you also want to have a good healthcare system. And I think all four there's a lot of work that needs to be done on all four of them right now. And I think, the monies are there to sort of get there. I want to do a shout out to a group called Comprometidos, con PR Metidos in a way. They are doing a great job in terms of linking, sort of matching folks who are returning to the island with jobs on the island. So it's NGOs continue to sort of win at the end of the day in terms of the work they're doing to help the island. And thank you all the panelists. I know we are kind of at the end of the panel, but thank you all for wonderful lessons and wonderful words today.
I want to wrap up with one final question that I would love to hear a response from everyone. We have a question that asks about philanthropy and grant making and ways to support the acceleration of renewable energy that benefits the people of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands with a climate justice lens through funding.
Okay. So again, that's part of the life-saving response that we received, right? That because the government had no resources basically to respond, the Puerto Rico government, foundations, donor organizations came in and provided funding in addition to the diaspora mobilizations that I mentioned earlier. And in particular, these organizations are looking to fund community-based projects and The proposal that I mentioned, the civil society proposal known as Queremos Sol, We Want Sun. And I want to clarify that that civil society proposal is composed of environmental, community, and also labor. Like UTIER, the Electrical Workers Union, is part of the Queremos Sol proposal, one of the co-founders, leading co-founders of that proposal to transform. So the workers at PREPA are aware that the system and are pushing and are working towards the transformation of the electric system to distributed renewables. And quite frankly, foundations, philanthropy is very important, but those public funds are what can really finance the transformation, the access to energy justice by low and middle income people in Puerto Rico. And so that we break with this current pattern that we're seeing with total energy injustice, where only high income people can access life-saving rooftop solar and storage. Thank you.
Can I don't know if, what order you want to do it, but I mean, I would agree. I think that we have a law in place right now. I think folks from all over the United States or even local philanthropy can actually support by sort of making sure that the law, which mandates 40% renewable energy by 2025, I do, and she knows it, I do disagree with the idea that centralizing distributed energy into a company, into a state-owned company, will actually do it. I totally disagree with that. I think decentralizing means decentralizing. I think you cannot decentralize and at the same time centralize it with a company that is bankrupt. So in that sense, I mean, I think we kind of disagree with, we don't disagree with the goals, we disagree with the way to get there. So I would actually advocate, as Law 17 says, distributed energy means distributed, breaking away with the monopoly. I think the state should not have a monopoly over energy. We have seen the dire results of a bankrupt company, and we have seen the dire results of a hell of a lot of corruption over the last 30 years on state-owned entities. So I would advocate for a more distributed system that is more robust by having local towns, co-ops. We have not talked about co-ops and the fact that energy co-ops there are over 900 of them all over the United States. I think users and the people should own the system and not any particular government entity.
And Jason, this is Adrian. I think the only thing I would add is I think what you're hearing is we need community-led economic development, right? I mean, we need to let the community really have a voice at the table. I believe Jennifer was mentioning that there's an election coming up. Our people have to speak on their own behalf, right? So every time there's an election coming up, you need to make sure that the folks that you vote for are aligned with what you believe needs to happen in Puerto Rico and the USVI.
And what I'll add, I guess on the terms of philanthropy and supporting climate justice in Puerto Rico, it is, first of all, learning about groups that support strong community leadership, that build long-term opportunities for social economical development, and that invest in infrastructure and access. I think Maria was a tragic event, but it's an example of all the things that are happening because of the climate crisis. So we do need to make sure that community groups, community leaders have the tools to keep confronting the climate crisis in Puerto Rico. So philanthropy and in grant making, make sure that you investigate that the groups that you're supporting build, those infrastructures for the long term.
I actually don't have much more to add than that. Just to keep, the community groups are really where it's at. We are tend to be the ones that are a little bit more in touch with what's going on and what the needs are, and how to solve them in a somewhat more nimble way than government agencies can, and that can hopefully move us forward in a quicker way. In terms of the philanthropy also, working with the community groups, but Oh, shoot. I just lost my thought. Well, yeah, keep working with the community groups. We'll go with that.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in on that question. And thank you to all of our panelists. Again, thank you to everybody who chimed in the comments. I want to remind everybody to remain engaged in the rest of the symposium and the rest of the conference. There's a lunch keynote starting at 12:40. You can also check out the bios for our amazing speakers more in depth and how to get in contact with them on the website if you do wish to remain and continue having these conversations. With that, I want to thank everybody who's been working behind the scenes. Courtney, thank you so much. Thank you to the staff at Siege. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Gracias.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Gracias.
Thank you.